Great. So what I wanted to do in this segment is just do an open AMA. So really talk about anything that is top of mind for folks. Of course, anything ideally Filecoin related. So just focus. I could talk about many things, maybe Filecoin or IPFS or open protocol crypto network related. So yeah, anything that anyone wants to talk about. Raise your hand if you have questions, so I can spot. Anybody? Yeah, first one is always hard. Yeah.
Hey, Stefano from Long Hedge Ventures. So one question I have specific to FVM is, have you seen, and if you have, what kind of use cases around decentralized AI being built on FVM? Would love to hear about that.
Yeah, so a bunch of really interesting use cases and a ton of potential. So I think maybe I'll speak about some of the stuff that's going on right now, and then I'll talk about kind of where I think it should head. So you saw LilyPad and WaterLily earlier today, and that work is super exciting, where you now have the ability to do computation jobs, to do inference runs on top of FVM. So you can use FVM to coordinate the inference runs and do some generative AI or LLM style use cases. And so that's already live and running today, which is pretty sweet. Where I think it's going to get very exciting is when you can start doing very large scale computational networks. So meaning take that model that is now you can see it working today, and that's a strong POC, but it's not yet kind of at larger scale. As soon as the compute over data networks arrive in larger, and we get a lot of compute nodes, that's when you can start doing massive scale inference, and then after that, training. So the big one is going to be training, because training is just dramatically harder in terms of the intensity of the computation. And the Filecoin network is one of the largest assemblies of GPUs on the planet. So that just kind of goes hand in hand extremely well. It's not going to be the same exact hardware setup. So I think SPs that want to do this are going to have to tune some of their setups to optimize for the AI use cases. But that will be, I think, really, really promising. There's a bunch of technology landing over the next 6, 12, 24 months that is going to enable a lot of this. There's many compute over data networks that are going towards the AI use case. And I would expect to see a bunch of them starting to launch their products sometime in the next 12 to 18 months. Might be sooner, might be 6, because the AI field just has to move really fast. But it's still kind of early. A lot of the systems are still fairly early. So I would kind of expect 12, 24 months. And here, in terms of the broad use cases, in terms of application and user stuff, I would first target just running infrastructure for anybody else in the mainstream world, and then separately find the areas where having the decentralized blockchain-powered connectivity is a huge advantage. So for example, being able to do governance over the data sets, figure out all the provenance of the what data the model has been trained on, what was the algorithm that it was used to train on, what snapshots of the models to know that you're running on the right thing, provenance on the prompts, what was asked for the model to do, who asked it, all of that information, tracing all of that is going to be super, super valuable for the world. But blockchain systems are perfectly tuned for that, right? This is just all a bunch of CIDs for all of these things, moving them around with IPFS. So we're perfectly tuned for that kind of special advantage type of use case. So we'd expect to see a lot of things there. Cool. Yep.
Question on the mic.
Yeah, could actually ask if you want to figure out who is next, and so that way track the stack.
Yeah, go ahead, and if you do have a question, even while Juan is asking one, if you just raise your hand, we'll keep a sort of mental cue. And a friendly reminder, we have a ton of people actually streaming in, so this is for live and online audience, so thanks.
Can you see the questions on chat?
That's a great question.
Because if you can, then you can moderate and decide which ones of those you want to take on. Sounds good.
Hi, Will Scheinman from Road Capital, covers storage for a long time, love what you're doing. My question is, what's the largest levers you have to increase network utilization to something more like 50 or 60%, from 10%, which I think is where today?
Yeah, just scaling the data onboarding, which we've been doing since for this whole last year. It's pretty awesome to see. We've grown about 4 to 5x in the last 6 months or 7 months alone, which is huge. That's a pretty fast on-ramp when you think about the scale of data onboarding that means. And so we're kind of well on the way to increasing utilization. So I would say just continue to scale the onboarding bring in more use cases, I think where a lot of the bottlenecks exist is the traditional sales cycle. So when you're dealing with large scale data storage, the groups of the entities that have large data usually take weeks to months to evaluate a solution and then do a POC and then maybe bring a lot of data. So ways of short-circuiting that and accelerating that cycle can be helpful, or just getting a lot more groups in the pipeline so that you kind of run through those entire business cycles at the same time in parallel with many, many groups.
Quick follow-up there would just be, does the regulatory designation for Filecoin impact the sales cycle and the appetite for large storage customers to utilize the network?
So I haven't seen it impacted at all. I think in general, that's the regulatory landscape is very different across the world. I think you're probably talking about the US maybe. I think even in the US specifically, most of the crypto space is pretty familiar with like the ridiculous condition. This would be my only comment on the US regulatory landscape. People are kind of familiar with like the kind of ridiculousness of the environment. It's like a very tricky place where there's tons of different perspectives and opinions, lots of different like goal sets and so on. Things are being figured out in courts, and we'll see how all of that develops. But I think I haven't seen that at all impact either in the US or broadly. Certainly not in a bunch of the rest of the world, where we're seeing tons of other countries now be very strongly kind of seize the opportunities. So like we just saw the UK, Hong Kong, and Japan in the last 6 months come out super strongly pro-crypto. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions?
What is the state of multiplayer data coordination within the Filecoin economy, and what do you think is the rate limiter for seeing like adoption and eventually acceleration with some of the more interesting or promising use cases, whether they be data DAOs or even be moving past the DAO piece, but the multiplayer coordination piece?
Yeah, can you say more about like which parts of the multiplayer coordination do you mean? Do you mean like the onboarding piece or the upkeep or?
The data coordination piece of being able to use that data and utilize that data for use cases, actual use cases, because I feel like that will touch more of like consumer and help Filecoin reach more mass adoption or crossing the chasm. So
yeah,
how does that will touch users?
So very concretely, this means like once users have brought on data into the network, how do users get to use that data for a bunch of different applications and so on? And a lot of that right now is rate limited by compute over data networks. So if you're a client, you can store the data and get it back yourself or give a pointer to somebody else. But if you want to do anything much more interesting, like run computation in the network, then you need some way of scheduling the computation and shipping it out to be run at the storage provider. And that's where networks like Bacalao and a bunch of the compute over data networks come in. So I think some amount of that is getting prototyped and we're getting POCs now. I would expect those to be kind of in larger scale production use in say 12 to 18 months maybe. We'll probably see kind of some smooth growth there. Recommend checking out the Bacalao projects. I think before that, there might be other applications that kind of like try to do it without having to rely on some of those cloud networks, and we might see some successes there. But I think it'll be fairly limited. It won't be like fully multiplayer where you can put in some data set and walk away and somebody else comes in and writes an application on top of that data set, and then somebody else writes a different application on that data set and so on. Like all of that kind of stuff requires the cloud networks. Today, like the computation that's happening, it's like a single client storing and then pulling back their data to then compute it themselves somewhere else. Like, Jupyter Notebook style use cases. Cool. Other questions? Yeah, there we go.
We do have one coming in from the Slack as well. Okay.
Which sectors do we see kind of pushing the way forward in terms of taking on decentralized storage first, or do you think that it's not really a sector issue, it's just in terms of when you guys reach scalability?
So the kind of like the first adopter sector was kind of Web3 applications themselves, and most of that data is very small. So all of Web3 things are in kind of like the low number of petabytes. So think of like 2 to 5 petabytes is all of the Web3 data, all of the blockchains, all of the smart contracts, all of the things they point to, and so on, all of the NFTs. And so we saw a ton of that adoption in 2021. So that's kind of like when that sector came in, mainly supported by on-ramps like NFTL storage, Web3 storage, and projects like that. And so that includes, smart contracts and other chains, referencing objects, and so on. But all that data is tiny. Like we can onboard all of Web3 and be like, okay, great, that's like 0.001% of the network. So the next sector after that was groups that have large amounts of data where some of the Filecoin features are really valuable to them. So for example, getting verifiability is like really crucial, or decentralization of the data itself is really appealing, or kind of this commons-oriented mentality. And that really lands you in kind of large-scale data science. So they have huge amounts of data. They really care about the long-term storage of that data verifiably. They tend to dislike centralized providers and want to go for decentralized network-oriented systems. They really care about many people being able to access that data. They're really well aligned with the kind of ethos of the network. And so that whole segment is kind of where a lot of the adoption right now is coming from. So that sector is adopting. There's all kinds of massive scale data sets coming in from many universities around the world, huge scientific institutions like the Atlas experiment at CERN, a whole bunch of many different universities. And that's a super exciting use case because that lets you prototype all of the computing side as well, because that community really wants to run all this data analysis on top of that data. So, think of being able to run large-scale data analysis or Jupyter Notebook style things, or creating graphs and all of that, and do it in a way where you can track all the provenance of the data and you can do it reproducibly. Like that's a huge, huge benefit to that community. Kind of the next frontier after that is kind of large-scale enterprise groups that have huge amounts of data. It's usually private data in some way, and for whom they're willing to be early adopters in new technology for some really important feature set, or for cost. So cost is a huge driver of adoption for all of Filecoin, right? So all of the utilization that we're seeing, all of the success that we're seeing in the network comes from Filecoin being able to offer a much cheaper alternative than the centralized providers, because they have to go through such a hurdle in terms of trying out a new technology or something like that, that the cost is the big decision maker point. And so that's where Filecoin Plus is crucial to making that entire flywheel work.
So a question coming in from the chat. So there was a lot of excitement around the SETI and Lockheed Martin deals. We're wondering if you can comment on the future of space-related deals or efforts.
Yeah, so I wasn't involved in those at all, so I can't comment on those other than like watching the news and being like, "Wow, this is awesome." So at least for me, like it's been a dream for 10 years now. It's gonna be 10 years for IPFS next year, which is like a huge deal. Yeah. So those projects are actually getting IPFS to actually become interplanetary, and that's going to be super, super exciting. So I'm very, very stoked for those. I think like it's going to push a bunch of the tech to get better for delay tolerant networks. It also opens a door for what does it mean to have international space commerce. Like I don't see that happening in the next 5 years, but maybe the next 10. And I think that's where blockchains become really interesting. And that's where interplanetary consensus becomes really valuable because you no longer have to wait for Earth times to clear. And I think like all those use cases will be really, really cool. So yeah, very excited about all the space stuff, looking to get much more involved in it, but I don't know much about it because I'm very plugged into other things right now.
Yeah, thank you. We got one over here.
Yeah, right here. I think around 2017, 2016, there was a lot of hype around data streaming protocols and so forth that came out of it. None of these went anywhere. Like they all pretty much died out because essentially distributed real-time data streaming is complicated. And when you look at, IPFS and Filecoin, it's for the most part, I think it's used for long-term storage or data at rest. But I'm wondering if you've seen kind of a resurgence of the need or people discussing real-time streaming and the notion of storing perhaps on IPFS or making it more decentralized.
Yeah, absolutely. So great question. So this I'll try to answer it succinctly without going super deep in the weeds, but also happy to go more in depth later. All the real-time streaming systems at the end of the day deal with static data of some sort. So all of their architectures are based on sending around bundles of information at any given moment. So all of that is compatible with IPFS and the way and this entire structure. Many groups have already done real-time streaming types of things on IPFS. A good example of this is live streams. Some people have taken entire video live streams and use IPFS to distribute all the content. This not an IPFS user, I think, but Lip2P users, so Huddle01, which uses Lip2P to distribute all the video real time, and then after the video takes the entire recording and stores it on IPFS and backs it up to Filecoin. So all of that is already getting proved out. It's not where like the customers really are right now. The customers for the Filecoin network are, again, these like small data use cases in Web3 or these massive scale use cases in large public data sets. And so that's why the feature set is kind of oriented towards that. I would expect the real-time streaming stuff to come after. So I would say like we'll get computational pipelines first, and those will put in place the streaming capability, some of the streaming capabilities, and the use cases will arrive after that.
Thanks.
Yeah. So another one in the chat here is, unless any in the room, another one in the chat is, IPC is an incredibly exciting and promising and ambitious project. Can you comment on its go-to-market or early adopter kind of strategy?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's a lot of possibilities for IPC. I kind of see two main trajectories. One is there's a lot of demand for subnets around Filecoin in terms of being able to run either applications that are like that would create too many transactions to put on the main chain already, or for whom like governance of a separate chain is crucial. And so there's already a ton of those users already excited to use and work with IPC. And that's been super exciting to see. And so that's a good trajectory. There's another side, which is just helping all of the blockchain world scale. So there's a goal there in the IPC project to help us get the entire blockchain space to get to billions of transactions per second. Because kind of the entire space right now is shooting for hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million transactions per second. And that's totally off. We need to get to billions and trillions. And so that's a much larger, broader kind of go-to-market sort of goal. And that looks like bringing IPC to other networks, bringing IPC to... my sort of prediction long-term is that all of the current L1s, all of the current L2s will get reshuffled multiple times over. And what the actual topology looks like in the future will greatly depend on what technology the world needs. So I wouldn't get too hung up on like what is currently an L1, what is currently an L2, what is like even an L0, because that concept is now like around. All of these things are gonna like get reshuffled multiple times over. So I don't know if that helps. But cool.
You kind of touched on it a bit earlier, but reflecting on Filecoin Plus and its rollout, is there anything you would do differently or change, or looking forward, things that you would adjust?
Yeah, I mean, I think Filecoin Plus is a really key part of the entire Filecoin economy and how it functions. I think that there's, like many systems, there's complexities and constraints and many opinions about how it should develop and how it should grow. I think looking back, I could probably point to any of the projects that I've been involved in, and with hindsight, be able to point out lots of things that I would do differently. What I think is more valuable is to think through like where are the pain points now and how we as a community can like orient towards good outcomes. So I'll maybe suggest like 3 or 4 ideas. And I think these are not like new ideas. A lot of the community is kind of talking about these, but I think they're good, promising directions. So one is just looking at the current structure and help support and improve how the current system works. There's a lot of people involved in the work of Filecoin Plus to actually meet the demands of the community. It's already working drastically better than it was 6 months ago, 12 months ago, 18 months ago. And I think all of the notaries, all of the groups building dashboards, all of the groups like actually doing the work are super underwater with mountains of work. And so helping figure out how to alleviate that and help create a better structure so that they have the capacity to help, that can vault it into a better spot. So that just means do what we're doing, but just way better than what we are by increasing the capacity and the bandwidth of all of the groups that are working on it. Step 2 is like experiment with programmatic structures. So there's been a lot of thoughts and ideas floating around in the community around, hey, let's go for like more, now that we have FVM and smart contracts, let's go for more on-chain based ways of doing some of this stuff. And I think that's like a really good direction. And so I think for that, we need a lot of experiments. So what I would love to see there is just a lot of groups trying out some of this and building implementations and shipping them and showing that they actually work really well to figure out, the core problem of distinguishing, kind of like legit data from malicious data. And then kind of the third piece there is thinking of like new economic structures on top. So I think that there's a bunch of ideas floating where people are finding alternatives and structures like Filecoin Plus that create new economic primitives themselves. And so I think there's going to be a whole wave of experiments here too. And I think that could be pretty interesting. Like fundamentally in the long term, what matters for the Filecoin network is that the vast majority of the network itself, like the storage that's on the network, is useful storage, right? So like the Filecoin network is for useful storage, not for just wasted work. So that means we need some set of mechanisms for how to orient the technology itself to help solve that problem of how to distinguish legit data that comes from users versus just wasteful work. Because if you just remove that mechanism, for example, then most of the mining on Filecoin would just be wasted work. It would just be like Bitcoin or Chia or something like that. And there's utility for those kinds of networks to exist in the world, but that's just a different network. That's not Filecoin. And so we need some set of mechanisms to distinguish this. And what those mechanisms are and how they're going to evolve over time is kind of up to us to figure out. I would expect a lot of experiments are needed to figure out better structures. What I do see a lot is a lot of people with opinions and complaints, but very few actual experiments or attempts at doing something better. So I would say, let's channel all that energy into trying to build better solutions, because there's a lot of complaining and not a lot of action. And so, I don't know, that's my 2 cents.
Okay, so we have time for one more question. If there's one in the audience, we got one right here. Yeah.
Couldn't one of those mechanisms to find which is useful for one or the other be sort of the value, a economic value? So leading into more marketplaces of the data economy?
No, it doesn't work. So the reason why that doesn't work is because fundamentally with the block reward, you have a certain amount of economic value that's going to be directed to the storage. And so sure, you can use separately some set of economic incentives for there to be value coming in. But if the block reward is adding any incremental value on top of that, there is going to be groups trying to game that and trying to just take that money. And so fundamentally, these are like I understand that argument, and it just doesn't actually work out. It doesn't pan out. Like you can create, and so sorry for everybody else, what the core of that argument is, if you have a marketplace, you could enable the groups that are charging for storage to give a signal, but they would have to charge more money than they would get from the block reward itself for that to actually work, like significantly more, not just like 2x more, like 10x more. And that just prices Filecoin out. Like it just is not it would not be a competitive storage network in the world. So I don't think that mechanism would work. We need to leverage the block reward itself to incentivize the broad storage of useful data. And that unfortunately, annoyingly, turns it into a game theory problem, because we have no mathematical cryptographic way of ascertaining what is a legit use versus abuse. So there's no mathematical cryptographic way of doing it. There's only social game theory structures. And so we have to figure out with those kinds of mechanisms. Cool.
Please join me in giving a warm round of applause for Juan Benet, founder of Protocol App.
Thank you.